He stopped when he saw a little girl sitting on the curb, her feet bleeding, while her classmates laughed. He had no idea this moment would change both their lives forever. Michael Harper, CEO of Harper Global, had spent most of his adult life in corner offices and private boardrooms, yet on that brisk autumn afternoon, he chose to walk. His driver had been surprised when Michael waved him off after the morning meeting, but Michael wanted air that didn't smell of recycled ventilation. The financial district was busy as usual, a mix of pressed suits and harried commuters, but his pace was unhurried. His mind replayed fragments of the tense discussions he had just left behind, though the static of business numbers and negotiations began to fade when he turned onto a quieter street that led toward a row of small cafes and a bus stop. It was there, against the backdrop of moving traffic and the occasional hiss of brakes, that he saw her. A girl no older than 6 sat on the curb, her back slightly hunched, her head bowed toward her knees. Her white dress, meant for something far nicer than a sidewalk, was speckled with dust, and over it hung a blue denim jacket that looked just a little too big for her frame. Next to her on the ground sat a pair of small sneakers, faded, fraying at the edges, their laces tangled in knots. Even from a distance, Michael could see the raw patches of skin on her heels and toes, the faint glisten of fresh blood soaking into her socks. 2 boys and a girl, roughly her age, stood a few feet away. They weren't talking to her, they were talking about her. Their whispers were accompanied by smirks, occasional glances in her direction, and bursts of laughter that made her shoulders tense each time the sound reached her. She didn't respond, didn't look up. She simply sat there, as though willing herself to shrink small enough to vanish. Michael slowed as he approached, telling himself he was just curious, that he would keep walking in another moment. But his gaze lingered on the sneakers, too small by at least a size, the inner lining torn enough to scrape skin with every step. He thought of how blisters form slowly, each one growing more painful until every movement feels like a punishment. She must have walked this way for days, if not weeks. He noticed something else, the stillness of her hands in her lap. Most children, even in sadness, shift and fidget, they play with a loose thread or tap their fingers. She was utterly motionless, the kind of stillness that spoke of exhaustion more than calm. The 3 children nearby gave one final snicker and walked off down the block. Michael's eyes followed them for a moment, then returned to the girl. The street noises seemed sharper now, the rattle of a passing delivery truck, the uneven hum of a bus engine idling at the light, but none of it masked the quiet weight of the scene before him. He stopped in front of her and crouched down so they were at eye level. His shadow fell over her, and she lifted her head just enough to see who had approached. Her eyes were brown, deep and wary, as if she had learned already that strangers rarely stopped without wanting something in return. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. For Michael, the moment stretched. He had built a life on decisiveness, on reading a situation quickly and acting without hesitation. This was no corporate deal, no market shift to calculate. Yet he felt the same pull he did when standing at the edge of a high-stakes decision, only this time it wasn't profit or loss that hung in the balance. It was the quiet, blood-speckled feet of a child who clearly had nowhere else to go, and the way she sat as if the world had already decided her place in it. He realized he wasn't walking past her. Not today. Not ever, if he could help it. He stayed crouched for a moment longer, letting the girl see that he wasn't going to rush her or demand an answer she wasn't ready to give. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and even, careful not to sound like an authority figure or another stranger telling her what to do. "Are you hurt?" She hesitated, glancing down at her feet as though weighing whether telling the truth would make anything worse. "They just hurt," she said at last, her tone barely above a whisper. Michael followed her gaze to the sneakers on the ground. Up close, they were worse than he had thought, creases hardened with dirt, soles thinned almost to paper, the toe box so tight it had rubbed the skin raw. The socks underneath were streaked with dull red stains where the fabric had pressed into broken blisters. "Why aren't you wearing them?" he asked gently. She shrugged, and it was a small, defeated movement. "They're too small." Mom said my feet grew too fast. She can't buy new ones now. She paused, as if deciding whether to say more. Dad, he took our money. All of it. Her words trailed off quickly, as though she had stepped somewhere she wasn't supposed to. Michael didn't press her, but in that brief gap of silence he imagined the weight behind those few sentences, a home where trust had been broken, where the simplest need like a pair of shoes had become an impossible request. A cold gust rattled the leaves along the sidewalk, and she pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders. It was then he noticed the slight tremor in her hands, not just from the chill but from something deeper, the kind of weariness that made a child look older than her years. "What's your name?" he asked, keeping his tone as steady as possible. "Emma," she replied, her eyes flicking up to meet his for the first time. The moment they did, he saw something that made him pause. There was resilience there, buried beneath the caution, as if she had taught herself to keep moving forward even when the road scraped her bare. He nodded slowly. "I'm Michael." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The traffic passed in the background, and the world around them seemed indifferent to the small scene playing out on the curb. But for Michael, it was impossible to see anything else. The idea of walking away felt absurd, like closing the cover on a book halfway through its first chapter. A car horn blared down the street, pulling him back into the present. He stood and extended his hand toward her, not in the commanding way adults often do, but as if offering her a choice. "Let's get you shoes that fit. Real ones. No pinching, no blisters." She looked at his hand as though it were an unfamiliar object. "I don't have money," she said, the honesty in her voice making it clear she wasn't asking for pity, only stating a fact. "I didn't ask you for any," he replied. "Come on. It's just shoes." She studied him for another heartbeat before placing her small hand in his. The contact was light at first, as though she might pull away at any second, but she didn't. Michael could feel the fragility in that grip, yet also the flicker of trust beginning to form. As they walked toward the corner, she glanced over her shoulder at the sneakers lying abandoned on the curb. He noticed the way her eyes lingered on them, not out of attachment, but as if saying goodbye to something that had held her back. They stepped into the flow of pedestrians, his stride slowing to match hers. The city continued around them, oblivious, but Michael's focus was narrowed to the small figure beside him. Somewhere between the bus stop and the next block, he knew this was not going to be a simple errand. This was the start of something that would not end with a box of new shoes. The sports store was warm and bright, the glass doors swinging shut behind them to block out the noise of the street. The air inside smelled faintly of new leather and synthetic fabric, that crisp scent of things unused and waiting for someone to claim them. Emma stood just inside the entrance, looking around as if she had stepped into another world. Her eyes moved slowly over the shelves lined with rows of sneakers in every imaginable color, her gaze lingering on the ones that gleamed white under the overhead lights. A young sales associate in a red polo shirt approached with a practiced smile, but it faltered slightly when he saw Emma's thin frame, the denim jacket slipping off one shoulder, and the raw marks on her ankles. Michael gave a short nod toward the children's section and said, "We need something that will fit her perfectly. Comfortable, soft, and with room to grow. Bring several options." The associate glanced at Emma, then at Michael, and disappeared among the aisles. Michael guided her toward a padded bench near the back of the store. She sat down slowly, her hands folded in her lap, clearly uncertain about what to do in a place like this. "You can look around if you want," he offered. "Touch them, see what you like." Emma shook her head slightly, eyes still wide. "They're too new," she murmured, almost as if she didn't belong near things that hadn't yet been worn down. The associate returned with 3 boxes, each containing a pair of sneakers in different colors and styles. The first pair was bright pink with silver accents, the kind of flashy design that often appealed to children. Emma tried them on without complaint, but Michael could see the way her toes pressed against the front. He told the associate to set them aside. The second pair was sturdy and neutral, a safe choice in white and gray, but Emma looked at them with a kind of polite detachment, as if she couldn't imagine herself wearing something so plain. Then came the third pair, white with subtle blue details that matched her jacket, the fabric soft to the touch, the sole cushioned enough to protect her feet from the kind of blisters she had endured. Michael knelt in front of her and loosened the laces. "Try these," he said, his tone lighter now. She slid her feet in slowly, and he could see her shoulders relax when the shoes didn't pinch. Standing up, she took a tentative step, then another, the rubber soles squeaking faintly against the polished floor. A moment later, she broke into a run, first a cautious trot down the small carpeted lane, then a sudden burst of speed that made her hair bounce against her jacket. She stopped abruptly, turning back to him with the smallest of smiles, not wide and unrestrained, but enough to soften the guarded look she had worn since he first saw her. "These don't hurt," she said simply. Michael glanced at the associate. "We'll take them. And pack up a second pair in the next size up." The associate blinked but nodded, heading for the register. Emma's brows furrowed. "Why two?" she asked quietly. "Because," he replied, "your feet are allowed to grow without it being a problem." As they left the store, the bag swinging lightly from Michael's hand, Emma kept glancing down at her new shoes as if checking they were still there, still hers. Outside, the city air felt colder, but she didn't seem to notice. For the first time since he had seen her, there was no limp in her step, no flinch at the ground beneath her feet. Michael noticed too, and it struck him how something as small as a properly fitting pair of shoes could change the way a child carried herself. They walked side by side toward a small cafe across the street, and he realized that while the shoes were new, what he wanted for her was something far older, something solid and dependable, something that would last far longer than fabric and rubber ever could. This was only the beginning, and he already knew he wasn't going to hand her new shoes and then vanish back into his world. The cafe was small and warm, its windows fogged slightly from the contrast between the crisp air outside and the heat from the espresso machine. The scent of roasted coffee beans and freshly baked pastries hung in the air, blending with the soft hum of conversation from a few scattered patrons. Michael chose a table in the corner, away from the draft of the door, and helped Emma slide into the cushioned booth. She kept her hands in her lap at first, still holding herself with the quiet composure of someone who wasn't sure how long they were welcome in a place like this. When the waitress came by, Michael ordered a cappuccino for himself and a hot chocolate for Emma, adding a slice of warm apple pie, with extra whipped cream, without asking her, because somehow he already knew she wouldn't have chosen it for herself. She watched the waitress walk away, then shifted slightly, her eyes landing on the bag with the spare pair of sneakers beside Michael's chair. "You didn't have to get two," she said, her voice tentative, as if she feared sounding ungrateful. "I know," he replied, leaning back in his seat. "But I wanted to. You've outgrown one pair already. Next time, it shouldn't mean you have to hurt just to walk." He thought she might smile, but instead her gaze dropped to the tabletop, tracing the wood grain with her eyes. The hot chocolate arrived, piled high with whipped cream that began to melt into the dark liquid beneath it. Emma wrapped her hands around the mug, warming her fingers before taking a careful sip. For a moment, the steam rising from the cup softened her expression, and Michael could see a hint of what she might look like when she didn't have to brace herself against the world. He decided not to rush her, letting the comfortable silence settle until she spoke first. "Mom works a lot," she said quietly, still looking at the mug. "She's tired when she gets home. She tries to make things better." Michael nodded, encouraging her to continue. "We used to have more, before Dad left. He had a car shop, and sometimes he'd bring me little toy cars from the store next door. But then he started playing cards with these men, and Mom said he owed them money. One night he took all the money we had in the jar on the fridge and left. We haven't seen him since." Her words were delivered with a flatness that told him this wasn't the first time she had repeated the story. It wasn't a wound she was picking open for the first time, it was one that had been left exposed too long, patched over just enough to keep going. Michael felt something tighten in him, an instinctive mix of anger at the man who had walked away and an unfamiliar protectiveness toward the girl sitting across from him. "What about the kids outside your school?" he asked gently, remembering the group who had been laughing when he found her. She hesitated before answering. "They make jokes. About my clothes, my shoes, about Dad. They say he didn't want us. Sometimes they hide my stuff. I try not to cry, but..." She stopped there, her fingers curling slightly around the mug. Michael leaned forward, his voice low but steady. "Emma, none of that is about you. That's about them not knowing better, or maybe not being taught better. It doesn't mean you're less. It doesn't mean you're not worth good things." She looked at him for the first time since she'd started speaking, and there was something unreadable in her eyes, part disbelief, part a flicker of wanting to believe him. The waitress set the pie down between them, the steam curling upward from the golden crust. Emma took a bite, the tart sweetness cutting through the heaviness of their conversation. Michael let her eat in peace for a few minutes, watching as the tension in her shoulders eased slightly with each forkful. By the time they finished, the cafe had begun to empty, and the late afternoon light slanted across the table. Michael paid the bill and stood, offering his hand again. She took it this time without hesitation, her smaller fingers curling naturally into his. As they stepped outside, he realized that while he'd set out that day thinking about nothing more than clearing his head, he was now carrying the beginning of something that felt far bigger than any deal he'd ever negotiated. It was a commitment forming quietly, not in words, but in the way he was already thinking ahead to what came next for her. The next morning, Michael found himself parked in front of a modest brick building with peeling blue trim, the kind of school that looked exactly the same as it probably had 20 years ago. He hadn't planned on coming here the night before, but after hearing Emma's voice break ever so slightly when she spoke about the taunting from her classmates, he knew he wouldn't be able to let it go. The playground on the side of the school was little more than cracked asphalt with a pair of faded basketball hoops and a worn jungle gym with chipped paint. Children were arriving in small groups, their backpacks bouncing as they ran toward the entrance, their laughter carrying through the morning air. It was an entirely different sound from the laughter he had heard directed at Emma the day before. He stepped out of his car in a light overcoat, the November air crisp but not biting, and crossed the parking lot. Inside the front office, the walls were lined with faded motivational posters and student artwork tacked up with curling edges. A secretary looked up from her desk, her expression instantly polite but guarded, the way people sometimes were when they sensed trouble was coming. Michael introduced himself and asked to speak to the principal. The secretary's eyebrows lifted slightly when she heard his name, though she didn't comment, simply picking up the phone to announce him. A few minutes later, he was seated in the principal's office, a room that smelled faintly of coffee and dry paper. Principal Harris was a tall man in his 50s with a thinning hairline and a tie patterned with tiny sailboats. He began with the kind of practiced cordiality reserved for parent meetings, though Michael could tell he was curious why the CEO of Harper Global was sitting in front of him. Michael wasted no time with small talk. He explained, calmly but firmly, what he had witnessed: Emma sitting on the curb with bloodied feet, a group of students laughing at her, the history she had shared about ongoing teasing and harassment. He spoke not in the vague generalities of kids being kids but with specific details, each one laying out a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as harmless. Harris nodded slowly, his fingers steepled on the desk. "I'm sorry to hear she's had a rough time," he said, his tone somewhere between sympathy and the mild defensiveness of someone used to hearing complaints. "Children can be unkind, but..." Michael cut in, his voice still even but with an edge now. "This isn't about unkindness. This is about safety, and about the environment you set here. You have an opportunity to make sure students understand that cruelty isn't tolerated, not here, not ever. If the message isn't clear from you, it won't be clear to them." For a moment, the principal simply studied him, perhaps surprised that someone in an immaculate suit could speak with such unshakable conviction about a single child's experience. Michael continued, telling him that he wasn't here to point fingers without offering solutions. He proposed an anti-bullying initiative tailored to the school, assemblies, empathy workshops, clear reporting channels, and visible consequences for harassment. He added that Harper Global would cover the costs of implementing the program and, in addition, fund the construction of a new sports facility for the school, one that would not only serve as an incentive but as a long-term investment in the students' physical and social well-being. Harris's posture shifted as the conversation went on, his initial reserve giving way to cautious interest. He admitted that budget cuts had stalled several improvement projects and that the playground had been in poor condition for years. Michael pressed the point, saying that the funding came with one condition: the school must adopt and enforce a zero-tolerance policy toward bullying, with regular progress reviews to ensure the program was more than words on paper. By the time he left the office, the outlines of an agreement were in place. Harris walked him to the door personally, promising to draft an initial plan and schedule the first assembly within the month. Michael knew from experience that promises could evaporate without follow-through, so he made a mental note to keep in contact until he saw the changes with his own eyes. As he returned to his car, he saw Emma through one of the classroom windows. She was seated near the back, her attention fixed on the paper in front of her. A classmate leaned over to whisper something, and for a fleeting second, Michael saw the corners of her mouth lift in what might have been the beginning of a smile. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind him why he had come. This wasn't a grand gesture for publicity or an act of charity meant to be tallied and forgotten. It was the first real step toward giving her a place where she could walk in without bracing for the worst. And as far as he was concerned, that was worth more than any deal he could have signed in his office that day. That evening, after his meeting at the school, Michael drove across the city to the neighborhood Emma called home. It was the kind of area he rarely had reason to visit, narrow streets lined with aging apartment buildings whose brick facades had faded to dull shades of rust and brown, sidewalks cracked in places and patched in others. He had dropped Emma off earlier in the day, but something about the way she had glanced back at him from the building's front steps had stayed with him. It wasn't suspicion exactly, nor was it trust. It was the look of someone who didn't expect to see you again once you left. He couldn't shake the thought that, for her, people coming and going without warning might have been a regular pattern. When he pulled up, the streetlights had just flickered on, casting uneven pools of light over the pavement. He locked the car and stepped inside the building, greeted by the faint smell of old carpet and cooking from one of the upper floors. The hallway was narrow, the paint along the lower walls worn from years of scuffed shoes and grocery bags brushing past. He found the number Emma had mentioned and knocked lightly. There was a pause, the sound of a lock turning, and then the door opened to reveal a woman in her early 30s with tired eyes and dark hair pulled into a loose bun. She looked at him with cautious curiosity until he introduced himself. "I'm Michael Harper," he said, keeping his voice measured. "I met Emma yesterday. I found her near the bus stop." At the mention of her daughter's name, the woman's face shifted, still guarded, but tinged with gratitude. She stepped aside and invited him in. The apartment was small but clean, sparsely furnished, with the faint hum of an old refrigerator in the background. Emma appeared from the small bedroom, already in her pajamas, her hair damp from a recent bath. She paused when she saw him, a flicker of surprise crossing her face before she padded over and sat cross-legged on the couch. They talked for a while, Michael learning more than he had expected. Her name was Claire, and she worked long shifts as a cashier at a supermarket 2 bus rides away. She explained, in careful, steady tones, how her husband, Emma's father, had once been a good man, or at least seemed so, before gambling became more than a bad habit. The debts had grown quickly, swallowing their savings, and then one night he had taken what little cash remained and vanished. She hadn't heard from him since, except for a single letter months later that held no apology and no return address. She had considered tracking him down, but between work, rent, and raising Emma, there had never been enough time or resources to chase someone who clearly didn't want to be found. Michael listened without interrupting. He noticed how Claire didn't ask for help outright, and how she carefully avoided making excuses for the life they now had. When he finally spoke, he told her about the new shoes and how Emma had handled herself with quiet resilience, even in the face of cruelty from her classmates. He mentioned his conversation with the school and the programs that would soon be put in place. Claire's eyes softened, but there was still a faint wariness in her expression, as if she didn't quite believe that someone like him, a man whose name she had read in business articles, would be sitting in her living room talking about her daughter's well-being. At one point, Emma climbed onto the couch beside him, bringing the shoebox from the store and setting it on his lap. "These are the extra ones," she said, opening the lid so he could see the untouched sneakers inside. "I'm saving them for later." Michael smiled and closed the box gently. "That's a good plan," he told her, though in his mind he was already thinking about how to make sure she would never have to save something as basic as a pair of shoes again. Before he left, Claire walked him to the door. She hesitated, then said, "You didn't have to do any of this. People, they don't usually stay." Michael met her gaze and replied simply, "I'm not people." It wasn't meant to be a clever line, just the truth as he felt it in that moment. Driving back through the city, the skyline rising in the distance, he realized that his involvement in Emma's life had already gone beyond a passing act of kindness. This wasn't something he could, or wanted to, set aside. He had built his career on decisive action, on recognizing when a door had opened and knowing when to step through it. And now, whether he had intended it or not, he had stepped into the middle of someone else's story, one that he could help rewrite if he was willing to stay. A week later, Michael was back at his office, sitting through what should have been a routine meeting with his senior leadership team. Graphs and projections glowed on the large screen at the end of the conference table, voices around him discussing quarterly margins and market expansion. But his mind kept drifting elsewhere, specifically to the look on Emma's face when she had shown him the extra pair of shoes as if they were some priceless treasure. It struck him that for her, small things carried a magnitude that most people in his world had long since stopped noticing. By the time the meeting wrapped up, he knew he couldn't ignore the thought that had been growing quietly over the past few days. He left the building earlier than usual and drove to the library, where he'd arranged to meet an old friend who specialized in genealogical research. Over coffee in a quiet corner, he explained the curiosity that had been nagging at him ever since Claire mentioned her maiden name, Harper. It was too much of a coincidence to dismiss outright. His friend pulled out a laptop, and together they began cross-referencing public records, immigration documents, and census data. The search was slow, with gaps where records had been lost or never digitized, but gradually a thread began to emerge. They traced the line back to a man named Thomas Harper, who had arrived in the United States nearly a century earlier from a small village in England. He had settled in the Midwest, raising 2 sons. One branch of the family tree led directly to Michael's grandfather, the other branched off toward a line that ended, several generations later, with Claire. The connection wasn't close, they were distant cousins, but it was undeniable. The realization hit Michael in a way he hadn't expected. All this time, he had thought of Emma as a stranger he'd happened to meet on the street, yet here was proof that, however many degrees apart, she was part of his family. That evening, he drove to Claire's apartment again. This time, when she opened the door, there was less hesitation in her expression, though still the faint edge of someone accustomed to being cautious. He sat with her at the small kitchen table, spreading out the printed family tree his friend had prepared. As she followed the lines with her eyes, her brow furrowed in disbelief. "So you're saying we're related?" she asked, her tone a mix of surprise and uncertainty. "Yes," Michael said, distantly, "but enough that it means something to me. I've spent most of my life with no family left. And now, I have you. I have Emma." Claire was quiet for a long time, her fingers resting on the page. Finally, she said, "That's a lot to take in. I don't know what it changes." Michael leaned back slightly, letting her have the space to absorb it. "It doesn't have to change anything you're not ready for. But it changes something for me. I'm not just helping a child I happen to meet. I'm helping my family." Emma wandered in halfway through the conversation, her hair still damp from the shower. She climbed onto Michael's lap without asking, a sign that her initial caution around him had softened. When he showed her the chart, she tilted her head. "So, we're kind of family?" she asked. Michael nodded. "We are." She considered that for a moment, then grinned, the kind of smile that lit her whole face and erased, just for a second, the weariness he had seen in her eyes before. Over the next few days, Michael felt the shift more acutely. He wasn't just thinking about short-term fixes, new shoes, school programs, he was thinking about permanence. He began discreetly consulting with a family law attorney about guardianship, knowing it was a delicate matter and that Claire's role as Emma's mother came first. But he also knew that offering them long-term stability, both emotional and financial, would require him to commit in ways that could not be undone. One night, standing by the window of his apartment, the city stretched out beneath him in a glittering web of lights, Michael realized how different his life had become in such a short span. A month earlier, his days had been consumed entirely by corporate goals, acquisitions, and market trends. Now, the most important thing on his mind was a 6-year-old girl who looked at him with trust he hadn't had to earn through contracts or negotiations. It was trust given freely, and that made it worth protecting at any cost. The day of the court hearing arrived on a crisp morning, the kind where the sunlight was sharp but not yet warm, and the air carried the faint scent of spring. Michael had barely slept the night before, not from anxiety in the way he experienced before major business deals, but from an unshakable awareness that what happened today would alter the course of more than one life. He met Claire and Emma outside the courthouse, greeting them with a nod that was both formal and reassuring. Emma wore a pale blue dress that matched the ribbon in her hair, and in her hand she carried the small music box Michael had given her weeks earlier, turning the crank absent-mindedly as if it were a talisman. Inside, the courthouse was all hard edges and muted colors, the echo of footsteps on polished floors punctuated by the occasional murmur of voices from behind closed doors. They were led into a family courtroom, smaller than the grand courtrooms Michael had seen in news footage, but still imposing in its own way. The judge, a woman with steady eyes and a demeanor that balanced firmness with compassion, reviewed the case file with care. There were statements from the school confirming the improvements since Michael's intervention, letters from community members praising his involvement, and documentation from his attorney outlining his financial stability and willingness to assume legal responsibility for Emma's welfare. Claire was the first to speak, her voice quiet but clear as she explained that while she remained Emma's mother in every sense, she trusted Michael completely and believed that formalizing his role would give her daughter the stability and security she deserved. Michael followed, choosing his words carefully, not with the polished cadence of a CEO addressing shareholders but with the straightforward sincerity of a man who had come to care deeply for someone who had begun as a stranger. He spoke about the moment he had first seen Emma sitting on the curb, the reality of her life before that day, and the changes he had witnessed since. The judge asked questions, about his intentions, about his understanding of the responsibility, about his plans for Emma's future. Michael answered without hesitation, but with the awareness that this was not a performance, it was a commitment he had already made in practice long before it was written into law. When the judge finally leaned back in her chair, there was a pause long enough for the sound of the music box in Emma's hands to fill the room. Then she spoke the decision clearly and without hesitation. Michael Harper was to be granted joint legal guardianship, with the provision that a petition for full adoption could be filed after a 6-month review period. The weight of the words settled on him slowly, not like a sudden blow but like the gradual grounding of something that had been hovering uncertainly. He looked at Emma, who had turned to him with wide eyes, as if trying to gauge whether the moment was as significant as it felt. When he smiled, she reached over and wrapped her arms around his neck in a hug that was unself-conscious and complete. Outside, the sunlight seemed warmer than when they had arrived. Claire lingered to speak with the attorney, leaving Michael and Emma standing near the courthouse steps. She tilted her head up at him and said, "Does this mean you're really my family now?" He crouched to her level, meeting her gaze directly. "It means I always was. Now it's just official." She grinned, and for a moment, the worries and weariness that had once been etched into her small face were nowhere to be found. Over the following months, Michael adjusted to the rhythms of a life that included school pickups, bedtime stories, and the constant, sometimes chaotic, presence of a child in spaces that had once been silent and meticulously ordered. The foundation he had started in her name expanded quickly, opening new programs in neighborhoods where children faced struggles like hers. Emma visited the centers often, sometimes shyly holding his hand as he spoke to staff, other times boldly leading other children to the art room or the small library. On the one-year anniversary of the day he found her, Michael took Emma and Claire to a quiet stretch of beach an hour outside the city. The late afternoon sun cast the sand in hues of gold and rose, and the waves moved with a steady, calming rhythm. Emma ran along the shoreline, her laughter carried by the wind, before returning to where Michael and Claire stood. She pressed the music box into his hand and said, "Play it." As the familiar melody floated into the air, she looked out toward the horizon and said softly, "It feels different now. Like it's not just my song anymore." Michael glanced at her, understanding exactly what she meant. The music, like their lives, had become something shared. And as he stood there with the two people who had redefined his understanding of family, he realized that this was not the end of the story at all, but the kind of beginning that would continue to unfold for the rest of their lives. This story is a reminder that life-changing moments often arrive quietly, disguised as small acts of compassion. Michael didn't set out to become a guardian, a protector, or even a family to Emma, he simply refused to walk past someone in pain. Yet that choice, made in seconds, unraveled into a chain of events that rebuilt lives, restored dignity, and uncovered an unexpected bond of blood and love. It shows that kindness is rarely just kindness. When followed through with commitment, it becomes a force that reshapes futures. In the end, what began as a chance meeting between a CEO and a barefoot girl became proof that family isn't always about who you start life with, it's about who chooses to stay.